Being a rookie, you come across the usual hazing you would get from the local police. But this place I was transferred to from the city was a big change being in a small town, so it wasn't that kind of place to haze. The officers I worked with and the friends I made were all pretty laid back, and hate to say this, but lazy and weren't really police at all. Not because of their laziness. I couldn't blame them for that. It was the fact that this town I landed in was awfully quiet with nothing really going on. Really nice town folk with no grudge to outsiders. Welcoming with open arms, which was kinda creepy at first. But I guess I was just used to getting mean-eyed by city people for the first 3 years of being an officer. So my first month being here didn't feel like a job at all. The usual calls would be about escaped animals from a barn or punk kids hanging around late nights getting drunk. Nothing violent at all, which was a nice pace, but very much boring. October 31st was something I haven't experienced here in what I was told. The kids liked to hang around this old road, Church Road it was called. It was the one road that led to an old abandoned funeral home, which was basically a mansion, one road in and one road out, and not to mention the bridge that you would have to cross on get to the funeral home. It was basically an island with rough waters, that not even a canoe would get anyone near it, which was a good thing. So Halloween night I was posted at the edge of Church Road, just at the bridge, which was surrounded by old dead trees. And yeah, it was pretty eerie since all other trees before church. Road were covered with leaves. It was literally like a wasteland of thick blackness all the way down the road, and I could see why the young ones would want to hang around here for a thrill. I sat around the bridge, keeping an eye open, and turned away a few of the kids trying to pass by, but other than that, nothing much happening. I had begun to fall asleep in the car, which I couldn't let happen, so I decided to step out and stretch my legs and have a cigarette just to pass the time. I sat on the back trunk facing down this creepy wooden bridge and could see down the road almost clearly a few street lamps leading to the mansion, which was barely visible with the wind howling slightly, like something straight out of a horror movie. I scoffed at the idea of something creepy happening, and imagined someone walking towards me from across the bridge, and have myself the creeps. I shook my head and flicked my cigarette, laughing off my nervousness, and turned to walk back to the driver's side door. Just as I put my hand on the handle, I took one last look through my peripheral vision and could actually see a figure walking at the end of the bridge. I quickly pulled out my flashlight and sighed, thinking one of the punk kids managed to get by me. I started walking towards this person as they walked closer, and I yelled out, "Shame on! You can't be out here! It's not safe! Now get back to this side and get home!" Shining my flashlight down on the wet wooden beams below my feet and shined it up towards this person you mind. "Ah, that's a little bright." I pointed the light downward and approached the person, and we both stopped at the middle of the bridge. "Cold night, isn't it?" the person says, and I nod my head in agreement. "Yeah, it really is. But sir, you can't be here. These premises are off-limit at all times. We get too many vandals and such round this time." The person stares at me with a confused gaze. "Oh, is that right? But I live just up this road. I haven't seen any vandals around." I look at him confused myself and look around. "Sir, no one has lived around here for years, especially not at the funeral home, and I'm pretty sure that's the only place around here for miles." The man smiles and turns his head as I turn my head behind me, hearing another car pulling up, and I see another deputy arriving. "Can you come with me and we'll talk to my friend over here and sort this out." The man nods his head, and we both walk towards his car, coming around the corner, and we stop as he stops right in front of us. I wave my flashlight as I look at him through his windshield, and he gestures me hastily, and he rolls down his window. "Get in the car." "Now!" I look at him confused. What is it? I turn to look at the man who walked beside me to see if he was giving a reaction, but you can guess what had happened. He was gone. I panicked and quickly got in the car, and we drove off, leaving my car behind, and didn't bother to look back. That whole drive back to town was the scariest silence I had ever experienced, and didn't bother to ask what just happened, because even so, I was still in disbelief about the whole thing. The deputy looks at me with the straightest face and rests her hands on the table. "I see you met my grandfather." I looked at him and shook my head. "I don't know what you're talking about. Nothing happened." He smirks. "My grandfather was one of the last people to own that funeral home. It was in my family for the longest time, but for some reason people went missing on that island. Not only people, but the bodies of the dead also. So it was shut down, and my grandfather apparent ever made it out himself. Something went on there, but no one really know what happened, and no one wants to find out because they're afraid they'll go missing. So next time, maybe if you are posted or have to go there, stay off the bridge." I took a deep breath and agreed to his warnings, and it was at that moment I found out a dark history about this quiet town. Maybe that was why it was so quaint. A few times after that, I had to escort a few of the kids off the road, but I never crossed the bridge myself cause of the fear of seeing that man again. Other than that, I never took the night shift at Church Road ever again. My job is the kind of job that no one wants or even dreams of having. I kind of just fell into it after college when I was trying to be a doctor. You have one of those friends that day, "Hey, this job would suit you," and you hate that they are right but do it anyway. I get a lot of alone time, kind of, with just one or two assistants. Nighttime mainly, which I prefer anyway, because the world is quiet and less dramatic, and it keeps me from avoiding people. Alive people, for that matter. I am a coroner and the only one in the district, and it is a pretty big district. So you can imagine the workload I get of people going in and out as I go in and out of them when doing When doing autopsies, morbid joke, yes, but that's just me. When I tell people who ask, "What's your job?" I tell them I work with dead bodies, and it kills the conversation, which is just funny to me. Also other questions like, "Ever seen anything scary happen? Any ghosts?" And my face just drops, and it's an obvious no cause. I don't believe in that kind of thing. I try not to. The one story I never tell because I refuse to believe it myself. And I've only told a few people of this one incident, and they either get spooked or just don't believe me, and I don't joke that often. It was a July night, so you can guess how hot it can be. Especially in the part of the world where I live, I had finally caught up on my work and hoped no other stuff would come through, but as life would have it, death would come rolling in. I get a buzz at the loading deck, and I go to inspect what had just arrived, and the usual crew had brought the body of a young woman, and they did it in such a hurry, which was weird, because usually we would sit out the back and have a few cigarettes and talk trash for at least a half hour. But the two, and then I did this with kinda just slapped the body down and drove off. Strange. Thinking maybe they had another call and were in a hurry, so I didn't give myself a second thought of it. I called my assistant, and told him to get the room ready along with all the necessary tools we would be needing, and such as I started to push this young woman down the corridor after closing the loading door. As I was nearing the main room where I told my assistant to set up, I noticed the plastic which held the young woman had moved slightly, which made me wince. There were cases where the supposed deceased were mistakenly called dead on the scene, but this wasn't the case, so I chalked it up to a death. Rattle. Air is pushed out the body by gas buildup after death and sometimes causes the body to move. Again, I thought nothing of it and did as usual, preparing our newcomer to find the cause of death. As I was reading the report, Jane Doe found unresponsive and no visible cause of death was what caught my attention. This was common, and this was my job to find out what really happened. I set down the clipboard beside the said Jane Doe, and the damnedest thing happened just then. I stood there at the foot end of her as my assistant stood beside the head area of her and seen what I had seen. The body had began to shake and moan within the plastic, which prompted me to quickly open the bag thinking the person was alive. My assistant helped me unwrap her as quick as possible, and as we did, her head lifted up with the deadest of eyes I had ever seen, sunken in and white as fog. I held the back of her head and placed my fingers on her neck, checking for a pulse as my assistant held her arms down to keep her from flailing. My heart began to throb in my throat as the body's shaking got more violent to the point where her feet began banging loudly on the stretcher. I stepped back and grabbed my assistant by the shoulder as we watched this deceased woman's body shaking like it was being electrocuted. The door swung open as another one of my assistants watched alongside us as she took a cross from around her neck and began to pray in horror. Neither of us had seen anything like this, and we were sure as hell that this young woman was dead as she felt cold as ice to the touch. And then I realized why the two men I knew so well dropped this body off in a hurry, which just made me guess she shook in the back of their transport and have them the same horror we had. Me and my two assistants took a few minutes in the hallway, trying to comprehend just what the hell was going on, and we had to do something, 'cause this was just not natural. Or nature, for that matter. We quickly made a plan to run back in and strap down the body as quickly as we could, and that's exactly what we did, but as we did so, transferring her body from the stretcher to the slab. Her muscle movements felt as if she really was alive, which just made the situation worse, cause we were at a standstill with no idea what to do. As she was strapped down, she just wouldn't stop shaking while the three of us watched in horror. Nowhere in the medical book says the bodies of the deceased would move this much for so long. Slight muscle spasms, sure, but nothing this violently horrific. It was a long night of questions and answers that just wouldn't come. We had no options and no other opportunities we could take. I considered calling a colleague, but they wouldn't answer at that time of night, nor even believe what we were dealing with here. After a good 5 hours of us sitting in the hallway, either of us refusing to go back in there as my one praying assistant still praying, I see her holding a small wooden cross, and it was right there. I had what was probably the best idea any one of us could ever think of. I asked if I could borrow her cross, and willingly she hands it to me. I stood up as they watched me walk back into the room and approached the body. I looked over my shoulder and could see the assistants watching me through the small glass windows as their breaths steamed up their view. I came around the feet end and slowly approached the head part of her shaking body, her head flailing up and down, shoulders arching inward as if she was trying to get free from the restraints. I take one last look at her twitching, sunken-in eyes, which gave me chills as her jaw opened and shut with her teeth chattering. I put the cross on my palm and placed it on her forehead, and just like that, her entire body froze, as in stopped shaking, but stood in place. I kept my composure as well as I could as her body looked as if she started to deflate and relax, back down on the slab. I looked over to the assistants and nudged them to come in, and I couldn't blame their caution of not wanting to come any closer from the door. I watched the body closely as I slowly started to lift my hand up, leaving the cross on her forehead, and I stepped back a few and finally felt a huge gust of relief fill my lungs. The assistants, I assume, felt the very same, but the one question that was on our minds: just what the hell were we dealing with here? 2 days went by, and I refused to work on that body. We all did. So we kept her at the far end of the freezer with the cross, along with many others surrounded her. I wrote on the report that she died of unknown causes, and it was the only thing I can do without having to work on that cursed body. I had her sent to some funeral home outside the city, far away from here, since no one had come forward to claim her remains. I had attached a note to the body and who may be working on her next. Do not remove the crosses as a warning. I'm not really a praying type of person, but I really do pray they take that note seriously and listen to my warning cause, whatever that body is. It's not natural or nature. Living in a small town nearly in the middle of nowhere, nothing ever really happens. Quiet and boring, with the occasional fair stopping by for a week and gone just like that. There were some other festivals that the town is just to keep things interesting, but I guess it's all right here. One evening my mother had planned to go out with a few friends, as I stayed home playing video games and watched the dogs, since they were always biting at the furniture, so basically I was a babysitter. I was in the living room playing online games with my headset on, yelling and cursing at friends. How any gamer would. As I was playing, I just so happened to lift my headset off to one side to listen to the dogs, making sure I didn't hear anything suspicious, and then I heard a faint knock, thinking maybe the dogs did push something over. I got up and looked around and found them sleeping in the back room where their beds were, and seen everything was normal for the most part. I started back to the living, and that's when I heard the knock at the back door. I thought to myself, who the hell can that be? I slowly approached the door and put my hand on the handle and nearly opened it till the knocking happened once more. The door handle started to jiggle, and the knocking started to become more frequent, like someone was in a panic to get in. I yelled, "Who's there?" And the voice of my mother replied, "Honey, it's me, let me in. You there? Let me in, sweetie." I was just about to unlock the door, thinking maybe she forgot her keys, but that's when I realized that she never calls me honey or sweetie. She was always a stern, stubborn person, and that was just her personality, but hearing her call me those names was unusual. I waited a few seconds while still hearing the knocking and the sweet names from whoever this was. It continued as the handle shook more vigorously as the knocks turned to banging, but the tone of voice remained the same. I began to get a cold chill down my spine while the door shook harder and harder. Listening to this thing trying to get into the house from the back door, Mom never used the back door ever since she always parked the car in the front driveway, which prompted me look outside the front window, and to my surprise, her car had just started to pull in. I waited till she finally approached the door and pulled her in as quickly as I could, and she obviously got mad. But I quickly shushed her to listen. The hell is that? We slowly went to the back door, and I whispered, "Listen," as she leaned in at the shaking door, and the shock on her face was a face she had never made before. The look of horror hearing her own voice talking through the door made all the blood from her face drain a pale white. We stood there as the banging sounded like it was throwing its entire body against the door with hard force. I grabbed a baseball bat from the closet as my mother was on the phone with local police while we heard her voice still calling out to me. Trying to peek out the side window, but all we could see was a dark figure with somewhat gray hair. This went on for another 10 minutes, when my mom had finally had enough since the police put her on hold. She presses her shoulder against the door as I was holding the bar, ready to swing if it did make its way inside somehow. My mother took a deep breath and replied in a loud, stern tone of voice, "Whoever or whatever the hell you are, you will leave, or I will be forced to defend this house with excessive force. You hear me?" And just like that, the sudden banging and talking stopped. There was an eerie silence for a few seconds, and heard the sound of what sounded like nails scratching against the door, moving downward, and the thing that pretended to be my mother changed its voice in a whisper and it went quiet once more. We both ran to the window and seen whatever it was, walking away back into the dark. There's nothing back there but heavy bushes and trees that stretch for 10 miles into nowhere. My mom talked to the police not long after and even warned neighbors across the fields about what just happened and to be wary of whatever it was out there. It never came back after that one incident, and no other troubles happened, which is a good thing because I can't imagine what it was at the back door calling out to me to open the door. Some of the townspeople have claimed that our area was a place where a witch used to love just past the tree line, but nothing was ever found. It just makes me wonder and fear if the stories were true, but finding out is something I'm not gonna venture into.